Welcome to Not Your Ordinary Parts, a podcast where we talk about hard things associated with the human experience with the goal of increasing awareness, growth, and healing. You may hear information from professionally licensed therapists, life coaches, healers, doctors, etc. This information is not medical advice or therapy and is not meant to replace actual therapy or instructions given by a doctor or a personal therapist. I'm your host, Jalon Johnson. My guest today is Vanessa Mejias. Vanessa is a licensed mental health counselor and a trauma therapist. Vanessa utilizes EMDR, internal family systems, acceptance and commitment, talk therapy, as well as the breakthrough protocol RTM. Vanessa's goal is to empower and support people who are struggling in their lives to recognize patterns that keep them stuck and heal past hurts while creating stronger boundaries and healthier relationships within themselves and others. So, Vanessa, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being my guest.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. How are you?
I'm good. I gave a brief introduction, but so that the audience can get to know you a little bit better, could you please tell us a little bit about yourself and who you are and how you got to where you are today?
Sure. So like you said, my name is Vanessa Mejias. I'm a licensed therapist in Central Florida. I started my journey a little bit later in life. I didn't go to school till I was about 29-ish. Um, Before that, I come from a really big family. So my grandmother on my father's side had 15 children. And from there, we just kind of expanded. So, um, as with your other podcasts, you've talked about intergenerational trauma, and with a family that big, that can definitely happen and has. Um, so, with all of that, I was a single parent for a few years. Have three kids, two grandbabies, and growing up, it was rough, right? So there was poverty and traumas there and things like that. So I started my journey as a dental assistant for many, many years. And I knew I wanted more. But throughout my life, I was very blessed to meet several people that taught me there was other ways to live life than what I was exposed to. And so that ability and those teachings just gave me that drive. And I knew after several years in dental, it wasn't what I wanted. I wanted change. I wanted to do something impactful. Um, I didn't know what I wanted to be when I grew up. I just knew I was grown up and I had to figure something out. So, talking to my husband, he encouraged me to go back to school. He was active duty military at the time. Um, and that, I started my undergrad in psychology. I knew I wanted to help people. I knew I wanted to help heal. I knew how strong people were growing up in poverty. You see the not so pleasant side of society, but you also get to see the strength and resiliency and the beauty of people and their tenacity and their mind and just how strong they are. And I just wish that, sometimes we could quiet the voices from other people. And so I knew that that's something I wanted to do, just didn't really know what. So then went and did my undergrad in psychology, thought that was enough, realized it wasn't. And so then I went back to school for my graduate degree in mental health counseling. Um, Fast forward, I had a wonderful mentor and supervisor, a clinical psychologist of 30 plus years. So I got to work in the community with community outreach. In his group, I was able to work with folks that had depression, anxiety, all the way up to personality disorders, bipolar disorders, schizophrenia, things like that. And I was able to really find out where my niche was. And through that, I noticed that there was a pattern. I worked really, really well with trauma survivors that just they wanted more than just talk therapy. That seems to be the theme. It's like I've done counseling before, it's worked, but there's only so much I can talk about what happened. I need to feel different. And so I started doing other classes afterwards. After I graduated, we continuing education classes and really learning how the mind worked and how the brain worked as it um, related to trauma. And so that's how I came to be and where I am now. And I really resonated with EMDR. I really resonated with internal family systems and acceptance and commitment, and also geek therapy. You know, I absolutely love using anime and gaming and movies to help push forward the healing process. Because there's a lot of times we watch movies or we watch anime or we play video games and things like that that really connect us with those characters. And there's reasons why we connected to those characters because there's human elements to it. And so I really love using that as well. And it's a different platform for folks. So that's kind of where I am at and where I'm at. And here I am.
Well, thank you for that.
Sure.
I remember when I initially reached out to you about the interview, one of the things that stood out to me most was just how natural it felt to talk to you about hard things. And then when I researched your background and saw all the things that you were well versed in, I knew that this would be a very informative interview because of what you do and how you do it. So thank you for telling your story and for allowing us to know a little bit about you. And now I'd like to ask a few questions to get the interview started.
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, so one of the modalities of therapy that you practice is EMDR. What is
Mhm.
EMDR?
So EMDR is a type of therapy that started from Francine Shapiro, and it actually started out as a trauma treatment, but then throughout the research in over 30 years, they it was able to be, or it is able to be used for depression, anxiety, just a plethora of issues. EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, and it helps people heal from the symptoms and emotional distress that they feel when a situation happens. So the standard protocol has 8 phases, but ultimately, what it is that when you have a situation that happens, um, the brain works, and you have your prefrontal cortex, right? That's your thinking brain. That's your human brain. That's the right and wrong part of your brain. And then you have your limbic system, which is the emotional part of your brain. And within that limbic system, there's the hippocampus, and then there's the amygdala. And the amygdala is like an almond shape. It's just a little bitty thing in there, but that's your fire alarm. And so when a situation happens in your life that is, it can be traumatic, and your brain doesn't really know what to do with that. It can store it maladaptively. It doesn't process it. It just kind of stores it. So what happens is when there's reminders, sensory reminders that come in, raised voices, a look, a feel, a smell, things like that, that might remind the brain of a situation that happened before. What happens then is your prefrontal cortex can shut down. It can, the thinking part of your brain can shut down, and the amygdala will kick in and say, hey, you know what? We felt this way before. We got to put this person in fight or flight. The problem is that the hippocampus is in charge of past and present. And so when the amygdala fires, the hippocampus doesn't really know that it's not happening right then and there. And so your body will react just like the situation is happening all over again. So that's why, a lot of people can go through talk therapy, and talk therapy is wonderful. CBT, DBT, all of that is wonderful. But what I hear a lot is that I know this is not my fault. I know this is not happening right now, but I feel like, I can't stop this feeling inside. I still feel nervous. I still feel, well, that's because that amygdala is going off. It's called the amygdala hijack. So it's really hijacked, and it takes time to calm down. It's almost like, and you probably, or maybe your listeners have had this happen before. I know I have, when you have something on the stove that's burning, right? And the smoke comes up and the fire alarm goes off. Well, you're sitting there waving the smoke away from the fire alarm because you know there's no fire, but that fire alarm does not. And that's what your amygdala and the
Mm.
hippocampus is doing, is that there's smoke, but there's no fire. However, your prefrontal cortex is not turned on to let you know there is no fire. And so until that calms down and you can look around and assess your situation and say, oh, there's no fire, let me just wave and open up the windows and all of that, that alarm is going to continue to go off. So what EMDR does, in essence, is help turn that back on, help you reprocess the situation and really bring in other information to process. So in a nutshell, that's what EMDR is and what it does. It uses bilateral simulation or stimulation. So that's moving either your eyes back and forth across the midline, either sounds that go beep, 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 again, or tapping. So again, it's back and forth stuff. And what that back and forth simulation does is it helps open up the memory networks, and it helps you process and allows your brain to heal naturally and do what it does. So that's what EMDR basically is. And you focus on a target memory and you go through that until it's cleared, and then you move to the next memory. Because what happens is with memories, it's almost like an anthill. I use a lot of metaphors, love metaphors. So it's like an anthill where you think that this is the problem on top. But if you look underneath, there's a whole bunch of different networks, right? There's different tunnels in an anthill that can go up to different things. And so what EMDR does is we work really hard to try to figure out where is that end, where's the queen, where's the main memory? Because once you take care of that, the whole anthill falls apart. So, it goes from, it's a bottom up approach instead of a top down, if that makes sense.
It's almost like finding the queen
Mm-hmm.
when you think about it. Wow, that was a great analogy.
Yeah.
So clients that you've worked with using EMDR, what type of transformations have you seen?
Okay, so that's a great question. With my clients and even myself that went through EMDR, what happens is you don't have that emotional response to the trauma memory. And it's so powerful, because what happens is you have this sensory information come in, right? And you start feeling nervous, or you start feeling whatever it is that you're feeling, and you're, why am I feeling that way? Excuse me. And you're a little shaky and you're a little nervous or whatever, what have you. Sometimes it comes out in anger. But after EMDR, what happens is the memory doesn't go away, right? Because the situation happened, but you're not responsive like you were before to the memory. You're not reactive like you were before to the memory. It's one of those things. It's like when you're riding a bicycle, when you're learning how to ride a bicycle and you fall down and you scrape your knee, right? At that age, that's like the worst thing in the world. You're crying, you're hurt, you don't want to get on that bike anymore, but you do. And as you get older, you think about it and you're like, oh yeah, I remember I fell off my bike and I scraped my knee, and you're laughing about it. It didn't take away the memory, but it doesn't hurt like it did then. EMDR is the same thing. It can do the same thing if it's done appropriately. And that way the memory is still there, but it doesn't hurt like that anymore. You don't have that reaction like you did anymore.
Wow, that sounds phenomenal.
So
Now,
it's a great modality.
another modality that you use is acceptance and commitment. Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, so acceptance and commitment therapy is more of um, an action-oriented type of modality. So what that is it has 6 phases, and you really are trying to diffuse and create psychological flexibility. So what happens is, and I know on your other podcast you've talked about IFS, so it's similar to unburdening for your listeners, but we learn to stop avoiding and denying emotions, right? With ACT, well, that's all therapies, but it's specifically with acceptance and commitment, it's understanding that your thoughts and your feelings are appropriate for that situation, instead of trying to push it away and trying to ignore it. So what happens is that once we accept the memory, or once we accept the emotions, once we accept whatever it is that we're feeling and we're thinking, we can move forward in the situation and make a commitment for the change. So again, that acceptance is really, really important. Before I learned about IFS, I used to tell folks acceptance and commitment therapy is one of those modalities that, everybody tells you have to love yourself before you can love others. That's
Mm,
we hear that all the time. You have to love yourself before you love others, but nobody tells us how.
mm,
Acceptance and commitment and IFS, both of those teach us how to love ourselves before so that we can love others. It really teaches us to accept who we are, because when we accept who we are and what we think and how we feel, we can start accepting how others think and feel, even though it's different. Right? So the judgment is lessened, and that ACT is really good at lessening judgment and the outer critic, or the inner critic and the outer critic that can come up. And so what you do is you, like I said, have acceptance, and then you do cognitive diffusion, which is separating or distancing yourself from the distressing thought or reaction. The third thing that you do in that one is you really learn to be present and mindful of the moment you're in. Um, and being able to observe your thoughts and your feelings without judging them. That's the main part, is just not judging yourself. The one thing I love about ACT is that, and this is the fifth part of it, is identifying your values. You choose your values, you choose your morals, you choose your beliefs. So ACT will look different for everybody based on your own life compass. What is important for you? Well, for somebody that is family oriented, they want parenting to be at the top of their list. They want to spend more time with their children. They want to spend more time with their spouse and not so much time at work. For a person that is career oriented, they want to spend more time at work and less time with, leisure. I've never heard of that, but, we're just popping things up off the top of our brain. But, they like work, I guess. And then there's some people that are burned out, and they're like, I'm working 80 hours a week. I'm exhausted. I want more leisure time. So that life compass really helps you look at what is important in your life and how much time and effort are you putting towards that. With ACT, we tend to find there's a lot of disconnect in our values and what we're actually doing. And that's so, so important to healing, because if we're not living authentically, there's going to be a disconnect, right? But how do we know if we're living authentically? We're working, we're paying our bills, we're hanging out with our kids. What we don't realize is that maybe those 2 hours hanging out with our kids is not enough. Maybe we're giving more to our job than we are to our spouse. So you love your spouse and your spouse loves you, but you see each other in passing. But your values, your beliefs, and your morals are like, I miss him or her, but I can't seem to balance this. And so there comes the disconnect. So ACT really helps you identify what your morals, your values, and your beliefs are, and teaches you how to live in line with that. And with those morals, values, and beliefs as your compass, that also helps you with the cognitive diffusion, accepting who you are, adjusting your thought process, things like that. So ACT derives from cognitive behavioral, which is really a lot of adjusting your thinking and stepping away from the situation so that you can restructure the thoughts and really give a lot of emphasis on, is this true?
mm,
So sometimes our feelings are not true. They're just there to protect us, but our emotional response may not be accurate according to the facts. So that's some of the things that they're doing. And then the last part of ACT is the commitment to make that change, to begin living your life based on your morals, your values, and your beliefs. So.
I wanted to comment on something you said about living authentically, because if you're not and you don't know it, it could be because of your life experiences or hard things that you've had to do. And when you were introducing yourself, you talked about um, that there was some poverty,
Mm-hmm.
but in that poverty, there was also beauty, right?
Mm-hmm.
But also, we may learn things or go through things that will shape us because of our experiences. So coming up in poverty or dysfunction, it could cause us to um, develop character traits that then wouldn't that could disconnect us from our authenticity, right? Like you also mentioned, if you're working a lot of hours and then you don't get to spend time with your partner, you only may spend 2 hours with them. You may think that loving your partner is doing all you can to take care of them,
Mm-hmm.
right? So you may be working however many hours a week to take care of them, but not then seeing them, but not knowing that seeing them is more important because of how you were raised, which is why I feel like these type of modalities and therapies are so important, because it can help you free yourself from patterns that may not be healthy, and also get you back to your true self and learn and teach you who you're supposed to be when you're authentic.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And that's it's like there's a saying that I absolutely love from Maya Angelou that says, "You do the best you can with what you have." I'm just paraphrasing. Um, but when you know better, do better.
Mhm.
And that's what therapy does is it helps you learn that there's other ways of being. Now, therapy may not be for everybody, but at least you can see a different way of being than what you were exposed to. Right. And whether you do the work yourself, whether you do the work with friends, or you do the work with a therapist or a life coach, it's something, it's a change. And that's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to change. Change is the only constant in life.
Mhm.
Now, if you stay the same, you can really feel stuck. And so, like you said, if you're if you think that you're working, you're providing a roof over your spouse's and your family's head, and you're giving them food and you're giving them clothes, there's nothing wrong with that. But in your effort to show them love by providing, there may be a disconnect because they miss you. So there is a very important component, like you said, to living authentically, but you have to figure out what that means to you, not what you learned. Living authentically and working crazy hours may have been your parents' values, but that's not what's important to you because you experienced a different life than they did.
So true. So true. Another type of therapy that you use is RTM. What is that?
So RTM is a new protocol that they're still doing empirical research on, but um, let me go back. It starts with reconsolidation of traumatic memories. And it
Mm.
was developed by Frank Burke from the R&R Project. He really started this to help veterans with their trauma. And what RTM does is it teaches you to dissociate in a healthy way. So again, just like IFS, it's unburdening, where you can step away from the situation by taking out the color, taking out the sound of the memory, taking and moving yourself away from it, so that you can see it in a different light. And it helps you with processing the memory in a very non-intrusive, non-traumatic way. So EMDR it can be invasive because you have to bring up the memory. RTM as a protocol, not as a like a modality, because it's still being researched. As a protocol, does really, really well with helping a person step away from that traumatic memory without even bringing up these feelings, and really looking at themselves from a third person view. So it's almost like again IFS, where you look at your different parts and you sit there and you talk to those parts. What RTM does is you'll be able to look at yourself, looking at the memory and gauging your physical response that way. It's a little difficult to explain unless you really go through it. Um, but it can happen between let me get my thoughts together. I'm sorry. So what
No.
happens with RTM is that you have 3 to 5 90-minute sessions. In the beginning, the main component of that is resourcing, teaching you how to dissociate from that memory. And then the rest of the time that is spent and the rest of the sessions are spent with desensitizing or decreasing that memory, so that at the end of that or at the end of the sessions, the 3 to 5 90-minute sessions, it doesn't have that physical response again. So that's what that is.
Okay. You keep touching on IFS here and
I
there,
love
so
IFS.
let's do it. Let's talk about IFS.
So I absolutely love IFS. It has been a life changer for me. So IFS is a type of treatment that was developed by Richard Schwartz. It's steadily gaining success as an effective modality. I mean, it's just so incredibly powerful. Like I said before with ACT, IFS, in my opinion, really teaches you how to love yourself. The motto of IFS is there's no bad parts, right? So all the parts of ourselves, we really learn how to love them, even the not so lovable ones, the angry part of ourselves, the rageful part of ourselves, the part of ourselves that was like, oh, Nessa, that was a dumb decision. Why did you do that? You know, those inner dialogues.
Mm-hmm.
They might not be the healthiest way, but those parts of you are doing what they can so that you could put one foot in front of the other and you can move from one day to the next. So going off the rails because I love IFS so much, but that's that's what it is. It stands for Internal Family Systems, and it helps people understand and work with their own system to create balance and harmony within. Right. So I like to explain IFS just like it says. It's a family. You know, it's an internal family. So we've all had people in our life, or friends, family members, whomever, that have different personalities, right? And IFS really works off of what's called subpersonality. So we all, every single one of us, even your therapist, have subpersonalities. They're like our friends. They're like our family members. You have that one friend that is brutally honest, right? So you are not going to ask that friend, how do I look in this outfit? Because they love you, but they're going to tell you the truth. And there's no filter. That can be our inner critic, right? Then we have that friend that is just super nurturing, super nice, maybe a family member that's that way, and is very gentle in their approach. Like, maybe we shouldn't do that. Then you have people in your life that are more accountable. They're the go-getters. In my life, that's my husband, right? So I think I mentioned to you before we started this, I have ADHD. And so my husband has learned to count me down. Otherwise, my time management is out the window. So we have those people that help us stay accountable. And those can be your managers that are part of your internal family systems that keep you going day to day, right? And then you have firefighters. And those are our friends that is like, oh, no, girl. Mm-mm. We're going to get you out of this funk. Let's go have a couple drinks. Let's not think about this. Let's not do that. They're not the best friends, but the drinking is not great, or, the substance abuse or the video games or what have you is not the best, but they're going to get you out of that feeling for as long as it takes. And they're going to do whatever they have to. And that's what that inner system does. So we have all these different parts of us that is just like a family, and they might not be the healthiest, but just like those examples that I told you, those people in your life really truly care about you. And they're doing the only thing they know how to do to help you feel better and get better and not stay in that hurt, right? I mean, how do you feel about hurting somebody you love? You don't like it. How do you feel when somebody you love is hurt? You don't like it. So they're going to try to get you out of that phase because it hurts them too. So IFS, or the parts of ourselves, really work to keep us moving forward, to keep us balanced, because that's the whole thing of human nature, is maintaining homeostasis, maintaining balance. If we are not in balance, that's where we're going to have a plethora of issues, and even stress, even regular everyday stress. You're driving down the street and there's traffic everywhere and you get a little frustrated. Well, guess what? You're not balanced. You're off kilter. Something's going on. And so what our parts do is they try to maintain balance the best way they know how, even though it may not be the healthiest. They're just doing what they have to do because they care about you. They care about us. They care about themselves. They care about the whole system. At the core of IFS, there is what's called self energy. And that is who we are at our core, our untraumatized, unhurt, unbothered self. That is what will help us heal. And why I love IFS so much is before I even discovered IFS, my personal belief is that people have everything inside of them to heal. We know exactly what we need, but sometimes the outside noise comes in. What people told us, what society has taught us, that it suppresses that. And our own voice gets suppressed, and we can't hear what it is that we need. Well, when our parts are able to work with us as consultants instead of taking over us, we can actually get to our self energy and be able to look at the world in a very unbiased, unjudgmental way, including ourselves. And so it's just a beautiful, beautiful approach that really teaches you how to love who you are, including the unlovable parts. And that's the hardest thing to do, right? There's parts of ourselves that we just don't like. Well, why not? That's you. The world is going to not like certain things you do. That's a given, right? We're just not everybody's cup of tea. Why the heck are we not going to be our own cup of tea? So
I love the way you described IFS, and I absolutely love IFS too. For me, it has been a game changer, a life changer. Just acknowledging that the parts of myself that I don't like or that I'm uncomfortable with, they aren't bad.
mm-hmm.
They have a job. We hear people say, you have one job.
Yes.
Well, these parts have one job. So we can't expect them to be or do or act a different way because they're doing what they're supposed to do. And when we acknowledge that and then work in harmony with that part doing what it's supposed to do for whatever reason, once we figure out why it's doing it, that's a whole nother, episode. But
Yeah.
if we can just get to that place of homeostasis and recognition that you're doing your job and you're not bad, I think that is where acceptance comes in, and it allows a pathway to be clear to self energy.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'll give you this to think about too. What happens when you learn that some of those parts, they have that one job, but that's not even the job they wanted to do in the first place? That was something they had to pick up. Then it gives you a whole different dynamic when you're looking at yourself and you're doing parts work. It's like, did you even want to do this? And it gives you a bigger appreciation for yourself and your parts when you realize that just as a parent, sometimes you have to do things that you don't really want to do so that your kids are happy, right? Or your spouse is happy. Or, sometimes you just want to lay in the bed and read or watch TV. You don't want to have to get up to go to a football game at like 6:30 in the morning. My son has fishing tournaments that we have to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning on my day off. And I'm like, I don't want to do this. But you do it because it makes them happy. Well, some of our parts, they take on jobs that they don't want to do because nobody else is going to. And if that is not the epitome of love, I don't know what is. Your parts love you so daggone much that they are going to take on a role in a job that they don't want to take on. They're going to take on a burden that sometimes they don't want to. Sometimes they're too young to take on. And they do it because they love you so much. They want to protect you. So
that was so beautifully and eloquently descriptive of what the internal family system is made up of, and how willing these parts of us that are developed, how willing they are to basically sacrifice any sacrifice to try and keep us happy, to try and keep us healthy. Um, and I think when we learn these parts jobs, like, and that's why I just love IFS so much, because it really is like the manual to all the things. Like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, okay, well now I get that. That makes sense. That makes sense. For me, it was anyway. And I know a lot of people feel the same way, but like IFS is my jam.
Yeah.
I legit think it is the answer.
Yeah,
I really love it.
absolutely.
So we covered a bit of modalities of different types of therapy, and the reason why we may need these things to begin with is because of trauma, right?
Yeah.
But a lot of us have a misconception of what trauma is, because we weren't in a plane crash, or we
Mm-hmm.
weren't attacked by a wild animal, or we weren't in a war. So to help kind of give us a better understanding of why therapy is important, what is trauma, and how can trauma affect the nervous system, is the question I wanted to ask.
That's a good question. So, trauma, in definition, trauma is an exposure to an incident or even several incidences that are emotionally disturbing or life threatening. And they have lasting negative consequences on our functioning, right? So, there are three different kinds of trauma. A lot of people think trauma is PTSD, but that's true to a certain extent, but then there are types of trauma that may not qualify for post traumatic stress disorder. So the three kinds of trauma are acute, and that is typically a single incident, um, a car accident, a one time event of sexual abuse, things like that. So it's usually a single isolated incident, natural disaster, things like that. Now, then there is chronic. So chronic trauma is repeated, prolonged traumatic experiences like poverty, war, um, emotional abuse and manipulation from a parent or a caregiver. Um, Even though there isn't physical abuse, so there may not be any bruises, there may not be any hitting, but guilt, stonewalling, having a parent or a partner get mad at you because you did something that they didn't like or they didn't agree with. So they don't talk to you for months at a time, or, weeks or months. And you get that guilt and that shame and things like that. That can be traumatic. Everybody's tolerance level is different. So trauma looks different for everybody. And I don't want to get derailed here. So, but that's chronic trauma. So chronic trauma is the repeated, prolonged witness to domestic violence, chaotic home, bullying, poverty, things like that. High emotional reactivity in a home from parents or, caregivers or siblings, things like that. And then the last, you have complex trauma. So complex trauma, and a lot of people, it's starting to become more and more talked about, is CPTSD, even though it's not in the DSM. Complex trauma is exposure to multiple traumatic events that are invasive and interpersonal in nature. So, a consistent, you know, sexual abuse, consistent physical abuse, consistent. So, these are things that's happened over your time, or it's a combination of those where you have sexual abuse, you can have physical abuse going on, you can, just different things that are one on top of the other. So you remember in the beginning how we talked about EMDR and that anthill, where we think,
Mhm.
okay, so, my problem is that my partner and I don't feel connected anymore. Well, once you start that EMDR, you go down through those networks, you'll see that there was emotional abuse here, or there was physical abuse here, or there was an attachment issue, and all these things are connected. And so complex trauma is multiple events that go over on top of each other. Um, and so that's those are the three types of trauma. Now you have big T traumas and little T traumas. Okay, big T traumas are usually the ones that you'll find in the DSM for PTSD, war, rape, natural disaster, murder, things like that. But you can have little T traumas. And it may not necessarily qualify you for PTSD, but that doesn't mean that you don't go through trauma or you don't have similar experiences. Little T traumas can be more devastating than big T traumas. And I'm not saying that there's a comparison between the two, there's not, but they can be, because it's almost like you have a paper cut. Not that big of a deal, right? But if you have that paper cut and it gets open and it keeps cutting over and over and over and over again, and it never heals, it's going to continue to hurt. And you're going to continue to try to cover it, and then it can get infected, and then, it just blows up. And that's what little T traumas can do. You're in school, maybe you have a great home life, but you're in school and you're getting bullied over and over and over and over again. Well, that can be a little T trauma where it's happening over and over and over again. Now, does that mean that you're going to be diagnosed with PTSD? No, not necessarily. It could be, but that doesn't mean it doesn't affect you in a similar way. Maybe because of that, you can't make connections with people, or you're standoffish, or, just a plethora of things. Anyway, what all of that is just that trauma can impact people in different ways. And sometimes we focus too much on the label instead of what's really happening inside. And that can deter people too from even going to therapy. It's like, oh, my spouse or my friends or people think I have a trauma response. I have a trauma response. I have this, but I haven't had any of these things. So they don't go to therapy, or they don't talk about it. Or what I hear a lot is, especially from the older generation, is, I got spanked and I turned out just fine. Did you really? Yeah, you've survived in life and you've been successful, but did you really? Is there, and we're going to go back to part 2, right? Is there a part of you that is hurt and angry? Why do you fly off the handle? Why do you, so it's just, the trauma can affect people in many different ways. Sometimes you can have a traumatic experience and it does nothing, right? Because your foundation, you're so grounded and you had a really good foundation growing up. And so what you would think would affect somebody traumatically, it really doesn't. So people are very, very unique. And we have to remember that just because it doesn't fit this label doesn't necessarily mean that it's not happening to you. So you asked about, how does trauma affect the nervous system? Well, now we're getting into a different theory, which is polyvagal, that we didn't really talk about. But polyvagal theory goes off of a 3-pronged approach, right? So there is the dorsal vagal system, which is freeze or faint. Then you have your sympathetic nervous system, which is fight or flight. And then you have your ventral vagal, which is your calm, grounded state. This is where you're connected with people. Things are chill, right? You're good. You're happy. You're calm. That's where we're normally at. Now, we'll run through the gamut of ventral vagal and the sympathetic nervous system now. And we're going to skip ahead a little bit. This is all part of your autonomic nervous system. Autonomic is what it means, right? It happens without us thinking about it sometimes. So when a traumatic experience happens, you're going to go from ventral vagal down to sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight, right? The motto of that is, I can fight for myself. I can run. There's mobilization. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But if a traumatic experience continues to happen, what happens is that pattern in our brain that we talked about, that amygdala, is going to continue to fire off when there's sensory information coming in. So your brain is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. And so your heart rate will increase, your blood pressure will increase, your digestion decreases, all of that good, all the things that it's supposed to do. And so sometimes when you could be walking down the street and you see a glimpse of somebody and you feel this, oh my God, that just reminded me of such and such. Well, guess what? that can be a traumatic response. So there is a physiological response to trauma or traumatic events, even though it is not PTSD or what have you. And you can become hypervigilant. You can become, all the things. So
All the things.
yeah.
I really love the way you broke down the brain and the nervous system as it relates to the event, um, because we really need to have a deeper understanding of what trauma is and how it affects us in order to be able to then know who we are and why we are so reactive in certain situations. And I really appreciate your knowledge because you made it so simple and palatable.
Well, thank you. I try.
You do. Um, so trauma in childhood. How can childhood shape who we'll become as an adult if we've had some trauma in our lives as a little person?
Well, that is the number one question in it. How do we go back? Well, so we have to go back to what I learned in graduate school, and that is so Eric Erickson developed what's called the psychosocial developmental patterns. So just like a child will grow up and go to the doctor for checkups, right? And the doctor will ask, is he or she crawling? Is she or he walking? Are they speaking? And they have to meet these physical milestones. Well, psychologically, we still have milestones that we have to meet as well. And we go through it from the time that we're born until the time that we pass. Okay? If something is not adequately met, what's going to happen is life is going to keep bringing up these situations so that we can try to learn from it. And that's where we get a lot of times where we're like, ugh, why does this keep happening to me? Well, maybe there's a point in your life that you hadn't learned how to appropriately cope or work through this. So just for instance, 0 to 18 months, according to Erickson, we are learning trust versus mistrust. And so we're born and we cry. There is no communication whatsoever. We can't tell mom or dad, hey, I'm wet. I need comfort. I need food. We do that through crying. And so when we cry and we're picked up or we're fed or we're soothed or, we get our need met is what it is, then we start learning that the world around us is trustworthy. Now, that we kind of go into attachment a little bit here too, where if we're a baby and we're crying, and guess what? Our needs aren't met. We're just crying. Well, we're going to learn that our needs cannot be met, right? The world can be mistrustful. And so you can develop patterns of mistrust or even attachment. That's a different podcast for you, but that's some of the things. So we go through these stages in life. And what happens is when they are not met or there is a negative outcome, it'll affect personality development. And that's so important to really understand. Well, I think, again, this is my opinion, I think it's really important to understand the psychosocial developmental stages and understand where you might be stuck. Because maybe that little person as a toddler, right, is learning autonomy. But you have a parent that's telling, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that. Or the opposite, I'm sorry, come here. And you don't let your child learn to have autonomy and to explore and to make mistakes. They're going to learn shame and doubt. And that's going to go down with you. Until you start learning autonomy, your decisions that you make will go down into shame and doubt. And that can affect the next phase. And it can affect the next phase. So when you have teenagers, right? And your teenagers are like, well, I don't want to have it. Family's important. I know I tell my teenagers that, right? I'm like, you got to hang out with us. You can't just hang out with your friends all the time. Well, after I went to graduate school and then I actually learned about this stuff, wait a minute. That is important for them. They're at that psychosocial stage in their life where they have to figure out where they fit in their world. They have to figure out who they are within their peer group. It is vitally important for teenagers to be with their friends, to understand what they like and what they don't like. It's important for parents to guide them, sure, but we really have to understand where they are and even where we are in our psychosocial developmental phases. Go back through our childhood and see how we were guided and disciplined back then at these ages and how that impacted that psychosocial developmental stage and how it affects our thought process and our personality and how we handle situations now. So that's
Okay.
kind of how that works.
Okay, so let's say that we've realized that we're at a point where we've had some trauma early on in our lives and we're looking for a therapist. We find a therapist and we start doing the work to, um, heal from our traumas and also kind of separate from the dysfunction that we may now be able to see. How difficult can it be to break away from dysfunctional or toxic family systems once we recognize the unhealthy behavior?
Mm. So, do you want the cushy answer or do you want the real answer?
Well, the truth.
So, the truth is, it can be very difficult to break. It is extremely difficult for people sometimes, not often, or not always, but sometimes, to disconnect from dysfunctional and toxic behaviors. But let's be real for a second, okay? The expectation of going to therapy is, oh, I'm in therapy, things should get better for me. Ideally, that's what would happen. However, we have to understand that we're dealing with people around us. We are not isolated creatures, right? So just because we're in therapy does not necessarily mean that they are. And as we start to change, there's going to be pushback because the people in our life don't know how to handle this new us. Sometimes that's boundary setting, right? They're like, oh my gosh, I never had boundaries before. And if you don't know what boundaries are, you don't even know how to take them. It could feel like an attack. So their defensiveness will come up. And then old behaviors will come in. And I tell all of my clients, I'm like, please, please be gentle with yourself because therapy is 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And that's where acceptance comes in, right? Is that you're going to go back to old behavior sometimes because that's what you need in that moment. It's not what you want, but it may be what you need to start learning to break these patterns. And it's not easy to break generational chains. It's not, right? Because you have those inner voices, what you've been taught, what society teaches you, how you've been raised to be an upstanding citizen and how to love your family. But we got to remember, were those teachings from other hurt people?
Mm.
So it goes back to what I was talking about earlier when you don't want to hurt the people you love, right? So as a parent, I go back to parenting because that's we can really connect with parents or even as children. But when you have to tell somebody no, sometimes it can break your heart to see them disappointed. But, when you have to sit there and think, okay, I got to pay the light bill or I'm going to take this kid to Disney, the light bill is a little bit more important. So you have to make that tough decision and say, you know what, sweetie, I'm sorry. We can't go. I'll try to save up and we might try again. But there's that disappointment and it bothers us. We don't want to hurt them. And the same things happen with trying to break away from toxic behaviors and dysfunctional family members or even friends, because they were there when you needed them at the time, not realizing that they were not healthy and you don't want to hurt them. So what do? We do the things that what we normally do. We sacrifice, but at what cost? And when you sacrifice and you give and you give and you give, you start resenting. It's like, okay, well, I'll just do what they want me to do. It's fine. And you don't voice that something bothers you, right? And you don't set those boundaries because you don't want to cause that argument, or you don't want to see a highly reactive parent crying and the guilt that comes with that. And you're like, all right, it's just easier just to keep my mouth shut and do what they want, right? We've all done that. It's like,
Mm.
it's not worth it. But is it not? Because if all it does is build up resentment in yourself, that makes you feel ucky. But we do it because we don't want other people to hurt the way that we hurt, right? So um, it can be very heartbreaking to set boundaries for unhealthy behavior with those that we love for self-preservation. Now, I think it's super, super, super important to understand, and I teach my clients this, the definition between self-care and selfish. And there's a lot of people that know it, and then there's some people that don't. But it's important to know that self-care is putting your needs, remember that word, self-care is putting your needs above the wants of other people. Selfish is putting your wants above the needs of other people. So as you're setting boundaries, really understand what your needs are compared to their wants. You need to be heard. You need to step away. You need this space. And that has to override their want of getting their way or doing what you want them to do and things like that. So it's really, really important to understand the difference between those two to help you break those cycles.
Mm. That was great. And I've never heard selfish and self care separated like that, because when you do it in a way that shows that needs are more important than wants, there's no selfishness there. It may feel ucky, like you said, or someone else may feel like their need isn't being met, but whose need is more important if we're talking about self, right? My need is more important than your need, and vice versa. And if it's something that's important to me and a true need, then anything outside of that could be, characterized as a want from someone else if it's coming from me.
Right. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Um, so something else that you mentioned when you're talking about breaking free from these unhealthy and toxic dynamics and behaviors and cycles is that you may fall back into a type of behavior in a moment because you have to do it, or because it could be necessary just to get you through that moment, or just for survival. Um, Something I wanted to ask was, I've heard this before, that the brain can't tell the difference between same and similar.
Mm-hmm.
And in those moments, that may be something that we experience. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so it's like we talked about earlier. There are three important parts of the brain when it comes to trauma and like behaviors and things like that. The amygdala, which is the emotional instinctual part, the hippocampus, which controls memory and understanding difference between past and present, and then your prefrontal cortex, which controls the emotional regulation and impulses, the right or wrong parts of our brain. So all three of these parts that work together create harmony and manage stress. Um, so when sensory information comes into the brain, um, and it's recalled that, oh, you know what? We've had this before. This has happened before. It's a good memory. And we might smile and say, oh, I remember when, or this reminds me of, and we get that positive feeling, right? And it happens a lot if you would notice it. Like you go to a mall and you smell cookies and you're like, oh my gosh, I remember hanging out, and this memory will come up, right? And it's a good feeling. So we're okay with it. We're grounded. Um, but we still experience that like it's the first time. Now, the hippocampus, it's active. It knows that it was a past experience. It knows that it has a similar feeling because we're grounded, right? And we're there in our prefrontal cortex. Everything's in balance. It's all pretty. Everything's great. Now, the same thing can happen with a negative experience. If you're reminded of a traumatic experience or just even a negative experience, the amygdala can become hijacked and go into overdrive. And so what happens is it'll react just like it did when the incident first happened. So your prefrontal cortex will be suppressed, or what I like to tell people is it goes offline, right? Just like a computer. So you're working on what's stored. Um, what comes to mind right now is like when I'm listening to Pandora and it kicks me off and it says you're in offline mode and it's anything that I downloaded. That's what happens. Your prefrontal cortex goes down and everything that happens next is just stored. It's stored reactions, right? Downloaded reactions. And so when that goes offline, you're less capable of controlling the fear. You're less likely to control the helplessness or the powerlessness, right? So um, what happens is then you go into reactive mode, and the hippocampus, whose job is to really tell the difference between the present and the past, can't anymore. And so then, because it can't tell the difference, your body will react just like the traumatic event is occurring, and it'll perceive triggers as the actual threat. Again, it goes back to that fire alarm and the smoke. Your prefrontal cortex is suppressed. Your hippocampus is not, it's not working to its maximum capability. So it's going to react like it's a past incident. And it doesn't, your brain can't really tell that there's smoke instead of fire. So, you're going to sit there and you're going to wave it and you're going to try to get the fire alarm to stop. But sometimes we can't until we take it out and unplug it. We take the battery out, right? Then we got to open up all the windows. Well, when we're able to take the battery out, that's when we start to become regulated and things like that. So when we talk about perceived threat versus actual danger, that's what we talk about, the brain not knowing the difference between similar and the same. So another analogy I like to use is if you're walking down the street and, let me preface this by saying this may be a trigger for some people, this analogy. Okay. So please be mindful. But if you're walking down the street and there is somebody that has a weapon behind you, but you don't see them, you're not going to react, right? Yet you're in actual danger. You can be, but you don't know it, so you don't see it. There's no sensory information and everything's fine. Now, for a lot of us, we're told, from movies and news, TV, all of these things, parents, when you're in a dark alleyway, you're more hyper vigilant, right? You're looking around all the time. You have your keys between your hands. You're prepared to fight just in case. But you've never been attacked in an alley. That's a perceived threat, but you're hyper vigilant. Your brain doesn't know. Okay? It doesn't know that there's no actual threat there. It's a perceived threat. Your brain's just doing exactly what it's supposed to do. So the same thing happens with trauma. Sometimes your brain does not know that situation is not happening right then and there. Your body's going to react because your body holds everything. Your body does not forget. Your brain might maladaptively store, but your body holds everything. And so that's what that means.
I never really, I guess, analyzed that dark alley analogy because everybody thinks, if you're in a dark alley, be on guard. Mm-hmm. But how many of us have ever been attacked in a dark alley? I mean, some people may have. That may have where it all started from, or that may have been where it all started from. Somebody 300 years ago was attacked in a dark alley, right? So now everybody is on guard against that dark alley. But if we've never actually had something happen to us in a moment like that or in a situation like that, we're still reacting to something that is perceived or something that was an old event that happened to someone else, which I think is the nail in the coffin for trying to describe what trauma is or perceived threats. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what if someone was listening to all of this, right? And they say, well, I hear it, and this applies to Billy or, Susie or Kim. They went to therapy and they did good, but I'm okay. Mm-hmm. How important is our emotional health, and is it easy to start the journey to emotional healthiness?
So emotional health is extremely important. right? It's extremely important and has a significant impact on our physical health. What we know now is that there's a thing called adverse childhood experiences. That the more adversity you face as a child, um, the increased likelihood there is for physical conditions, heart disease, high blood pressure, things like that. So research shows that with chronic stress, depression, and anxiety, it can affect the way our digestive tract works, right? So and functions, and it can change the physiology of our digestive tract. That's something called the brain gut connection. Lack of sleep because of depression or anxiety or high stress, lack of energy can increase symptoms, of the stress, and it releases that hormone called cortisol, which is a stress hormone. And when we have a harder time falling asleep and we have a harder time staying asleep because we can't just shut off our brains and things like that, then can sometimes lead to the onset of sleep disorders. Right. And then heart health is also a major component and affected with emotional health. So the more stress you have, the more cortisol is released. It increases our blood pressure, it increases our heart rate, and it can increase a development of heart disease. So those are, it's really important. Again, it's that homeostasis. Our brain goes in a specific neurological pattern based on our experiences in life. Our brain is a creature of habit, right? And until it learns a different way of being, it's just going to keep doing the same thing that it's learned how to do. It's doing exactly what it's supposed to. And so when that happens, you can develop physical symptoms or physical issues with your health because it's used to pushing out these certain types of hormones. It's used to pushing these things out. A little off topic is we know that trauma can occur 6 months in utero. So if your mom is having a lot of emotional stress or abuse and she's 6 months pregnant with you, her reactions to that stress, her own stress levels can affect you because guess what? Your body is reacting to hers. So again, that kind of went off topic a little bit, but emotional stress is really, really important in counteracting physical health conditions later on. Again, that question, is it easy? Well, it's simple, but it's not easy because again, we have to change. We have to be open to change, and change is scary. We want it, sure. But like myself, I would love to go to the gym. I would love to lose weight. But guess what? Do I? Because I'm comfortable. Right? I'm comfortable eating Oreos. I'm comfortable. Do I like the way I look sometimes? Depends on the day. But am I going to make that effort? Sometimes. And sometimes I have to be okay with, you know what? I'll try again tomorrow. So it's consistency with change and being gentle with yourself. That's really, really important. So when it comes to emotional health and going on that journey, just understand that just like with anything you're learning, you're not going to be an expert. You're not supposed to be. You're supposed to make mistakes. You're supposed to not want to go. The important thing is to learn from that and try better again the next day.
Amen. I think that was a wonderful summary of what it takes, what it feels like, and sometimes we're just comfortable doing what we're doing or how we are, and it's no point in not being real about it. Just be honest.
Yeah.
If it is what it is, call a spade a spade.
Yeah. But that takes a lot of trust, right? So
if you could give one piece of advice to someone who's on the fence about talking to someone or starting therapy, or just getting comfortable feeling their big feelings and emotions, what would you say?
Honestly, I would say listen to themselves, right? If there's a part of yourself saying, go to therapy, or, this is not the way I want to be. This is not the way I want to live. Give it a try. One of two things is going to happen. Either it'll help or it won't. but at least you'll learn what you like and what you don't like, and you get started on your journey. Maybe a therapist is not for you. Maybe a life coach is, or maybe being able to be vulnerable with a friend. What have you. It doesn't really matter how you go about your healing journey, but it's time for us to start trusting ourselves. And that is, I think, the scariest thing, is that we have to trust our therapist. We have to trust our coach. We would have to trust a friend. Whoever is going to help us heal on this journey, we have to trust them. But more than that, we would have to trust ourselves and know that we're worth it. Once you realize how important you are, it can make the journey a lot easier. The world is filled with people that will go to bat for us and some who won't. But I will guarantee you one thing: no one is going to fight for you the way that you fight for yourself once you decide that you're worth it.
That was beautiful. Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for this.
Sure.
This has been really, really great. I'm so happy to allow you to show your skill set and your knowledge, and you're so smart. I mean, you talk about the brain like it's, a car, like guys talking about cars or something. And I think that normalizing just learning about all of our patterns and the way our minds work and our behaviors is something that we need to do. And that's why I'm really glad to be able to present this information, and that people agree to do this with me and that they see value in what I'm trying to do and present. So thank you for this. If people want to find you online or on social media, where can they look you up?
Okay, so don't throw tomatoes at me. I don't really do social media much for the practice, but my website is www.connections-counseling.org. So yeah, you can find me that way. And there's a little box there. So if there's any questions that people have, if there's any information that they would like, as far as like finding a therapist, please reach out. I'm here to help. And that's really what I want to do, is just start people on their journey and then let them grow the way that they're going to grow. So
Great. All right, Vanessa. Well, again, thank you so much for this. Thank you for your time, for your knowledge, and for doing the work to be able to get to a point on your own to where you can give back and help others. And I really enjoyed this. I think that a lot of people will enjoy it as well because of how simple you made it and how knowledgeable you are. So again, thank you for who you are, for what you do, and the way you do it.
well, thank you so much for having me on and letting me share my passion and going on this thought train that I tend to have. So I really appreciate you giving me the platform to be able to share with others, and hopefully it helps break things down for them so that they can open up conversations with their own therapist, or they can start their own healing journey, whether it's with themselves or somebody else. So again, thank you so much for your time, and I really appreciate it. And I love being here and talking to you.